January 1945. Somewhere in Western Europe, the snow has been crushed into gray slush by thousands of passing tires. American trucks idle along a narrow road, their engines humming low, breath rising from exhaust pipes like smoke from a slow-burning fire. Crates are stacked shoulder-high ammunition, fuel drums, medical supplies, food. Everything smells of oil, metal, and wet canvas. The war has not ended, but here it is clearly tilting. Local civilians stand at a distance, watching the endless columns roll past. They do not count the trucks. No one ever does. They simply say the Allies are here. British accents echo in command posts. Polish, French, and Belgian flags reappear in town squares. Soviet armies are advancing far to the east. Victory feels collective, shared, almost abstract. Yet nearly every engine on this road was built in America. Nearly every gallon of fuel came across an ocean. Nearly every ration was packed months earlier in a factory thousands of miles away. The soldiers driving these trucks rarely speak about credit. They are too busy moving forward. History, meanwhile, is already slowing down, deciding what it will remember, and what it will quietly blur into the background. And to understand how that happened, we must step back before the trucks, before the victories, to the fragile world that existed before America carried the weight of a global war. September 1939 did not begin a world war the way history often remembers it. It began as a fracture sharp, sudden and localized. When German forces crossed into Poland, within weeks, Poland was crushed between two invading powers. Europe watched, stunned, as borders proved thinner than treaties. Britain and France declared war, but for months, almost nothing followed. Soldiers waited. Civilians waited. History waited. By the spring of 1940, waiting was no longer possible. German armies swept through Denmark and Norway, then smashed into the Low Countries and France with a speed that shocked even their allies. France collapsed in 6 weeks. Paris fell. The French army, considered the strongest in Europe, was gone as a fighting force. Britain evacuated its soldiers from Dunkirk, leaving behind equipment, vehicles, and the illusion that the old balance of power still existed. For Britain, survival became the only objective. For the rest of Europe, occupation became reality. From the summer of 1940 onward, Britain stood alone in Western Europe. Its navy protected the seas. Its air force fought for survival in the skies. Its cities burned under nightly bombing. Every victory, however small, was magnified, not for propaganda alone, but for morale. Britain needed stories of resistance, because resistance itself was fragile. Credit, at this stage, was not a luxury. It was a necessity. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched, but did not enter. Public opinion remained deeply cautious. Memories of the First World War still lingered. Isolationism was not cowardice. It was policy reinforced by law and sentiment. America supplied words of support, but no armies, no divisions crossed the ocean. No American boots touched European soil. Then, in June 1941, the war expanded beyond any hope of containment. Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, opening a front so vast it swallowed entire armies. Millions of men were thrown into battle across forests, fields, and frozen plains. The Soviet Union absorbed losses on a scale the world had never seen. Cities were encircled. Entire divisions vanished. Survival itself became an act of defiance. From that moment on, the Allied war effort rested on two desperate pillars. Britain enduring, the Soviet Union bleeding. Each paid a price that demanded recognition. Britain for holding on when defeat seemed inevitable. The Soviet Union for sacrificing lives at a scale that defied comprehension. By the time winter arrived in 1941, the war had already reshaped the moral hierarchy of the alliance. Those who suffered first and longest naturally claimed the right to define the struggle. The United States still had not formally entered the war. That changed on December 7, 1941, when Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. Within days, Germany declared war on the United States. The conflict instantly became global, in the truest sense of the word. Yet then American involvement was not immediate in the way popular memory suggests. The U.S. Army was small, its equipment uneven, its forces untested at modern, large-scale war. American leaders understood something crucial. Rushing troops into Europe without preparation would not save the Allies, it would burden them. So, while speeches were made and alliances reaffirmed, the initial American contribution took a quieter form, one that rarely appeared in headlines and almost never in early narratives. Factories expanded, shipyards worked around the clock, production targets were rewritten upward, then upward again. While British and Soviet soldiers fought for survival, the United States began preparing for endurance. Not for months, but for years. It was a different kind of commitment. Less visible than a battlefield stand, but no less decisive. And as the war ground on, this imbalance between those fighting immediately and those preparing overwhelmingly would shape not just how the war was won, but how its story would later be told. Because when victory finally came, memory would favor sacrifice it could see. Long before it acknowledged power it had quietly relied upon. By early 1942, the war had reached a strange equilibrium. On the surface, Axis forces still dominated vast territories. Beneath that surface, however, something unprecedented was beginning to take shape. Industrial mobilization so large that no previous war offered a comparison. The United States did not enter the conflict by matching Europe's sacrifices man for man. It entered by transforming its entire economy into a weapon. Factories that once produced automobiles were converted to build tanks. Assembly lines that had turned out refrigerators and radios began producing aircraft engines, artillery shells, and precision instruments. Shipyards expanded along both coasts, launching cargo ships faster than German submarines could sink them. In 1942 alone, the United States produced more military equipment than all Axis powers combined. This output did not stay in America. Under the Lend-Lease program, material flowed outward in quantities that defied traditional accounting. Britain received aircraft, trucks, food, fuel, radar systems, and raw materials essential to keeping its war economy alive. The Soviet Union, fighting a war of annihilation, received hundreds of thousands of trucks, locomotives, railcars, aircraft, radios, boots, medical supplies, and millions of tons of food. These were not symbolic shipments, they were structural. By 1943, large portions of the Red Army's mobility depended on American trucks. Soviet offensives moved at speeds that would have been impossible without them. British long-range bombing campaigns relied on American fuel and replacement aircraft. Even ammunition production in Allied countries was quietly stabilized by American industrial inputs that never appeared on battlefield maps. Yet this contribution had a problem: it arrived without drama. A tank rolling off a ship does not look like a heroic stand. A convoy crossing the Atlantic does not resemble a last defense. A factory worker in Detroit does not fit easily into a war memorial. Meanwhile, Britain and the Soviet Union continued to fight and suffer in full view of the world. Cities were destroyed. Soldiers died by the millions. Entire populations endured starvation, displacement, and terror. Their sacrifices were visible, measurable, in graves and ruins. Their stories were immediate and emotionally undeniable. The imbalance between contribution and perception widened. American leaders were aware of this, but chose their restraint. Politically, the alliance required unity. Publicly emphasizing American dominance risked weakening British morale and provoking Soviet suspicion. Privately, planners understood that influence could be exercised later. For now, winning the war mattered more than defining it. By mid-1943, the consequences of American production were impossible to ignore on the battlefield. Allied forces in North Africa advanced with overwhelming logistical support. The invasion of Italy, though costly, demonstrated a new reality. Sustained offensives were now possible without exhausting supply lines. Air campaigns intensified. Replacement aircraft appeared faster than losses could mount. Still, the language of the war remained carefully collective. Communiques spoke of Allied advances. Press releases credited joint operations. Victories were framed as shared achievements because, politically, behind the scenes, however, dependency was growing. Not weakness, but reliance. Allied commanders planned operations around American supply schedules. British strategy increasingly assumed American reinforcement. Soviet leaders, while emphasizing self-reliance publicly, pressed Washington continuously for more material aid. None of this diminished the courage of those fighting at the front, but it quietly shifted the center of gravity of the war. By the time the United States began committing large ground forces in Western Europe, the battlefield itself had already been reshaped by American capacity. The war was no longer about holding on. It was about how fast the Allies could advance and how far. And in that transition, something subtle occurred. The story of the war had already begun to form, rooted in early suffering, shaped by visible sacrifice, and resistant to revision. When American power finally stepped fully into view, it did so as reinforcement, not origin, as support, not foundation. That perception would follow the United States all the way to victory, and it would define how credit was later distributed long after the factories went quiet and the convoys stopped sailing. Because once the war moved from survival to momentum, the question was no longer who could endure but who would be remembered. When American soldiers began arriving in large numbers, the war already felt old to those who had been fighting since 1939 or 1941. British troops had endured years of air raids, rationing, and retreat. Soviet soldiers had survived encirclements, winter siege, and losses so vast they defied comprehension. Against that backdrop, the Americans seemed new, well-fed, well-equipped, and comparatively untouched. This contrast shaped perception immediately. American units arrived with clean uniforms, fresh boots, and an abundance of supplies. Their trucks ran reliably. Their radios worked. Their artillery had ample ammunition. 2 exhausted Allied soldiers. This was both reassuring and unsettling. Relief came first because support had finally arrived in force, but beneath it lay a quiet resentment. The Americans had not been there at the beginning. They had not seen the worst. American soldiers felt this tension. Letters and diaries from the period reveal awareness of how they were viewed. They were conscious of arriving late to a war already soaked in blood. Many compensated by taking on the heaviest burdens available: long advances, relentless logistics work, constant movement. There was little appetite for claiming glory. The priority was proving reliability. Yet human memory is shaped by beginnings. Those who suffer first often become the moral center of a story. Those who arrive later, no matter how decisive their contribution, are seen as additions, not foundations. This dynamic would follow American forces through every theater. They would be essential, often dominant, yet perpetually framed as part of something older, something that belonged emotionally to others, and that emotional ownership would matter long after the last shot was fired. Wars are not won when soldiers charge forward. They are won when soldiers keep moving after they should have stopped. American involvement transformed this reality. Where earlier campaigns stalled from fuel shortages, broken vehicles, and exhausted supply lines, American logistics imposed a new rhythm. Advance was the cost of that memory, however, was subtle. It left little room to recalibrate credit later once the story had hardened, because narratives born in crisis do not easily adjust to peacetime truth. And that tension would only deepen as the war reached its decisive moments. No Allied nation paid a higher human price than the Soviet Union. From 1941 onward, entire regions were devastated. Cities were besieged for years. Casualty figures climbed into the tens of millions. For Soviet leaders, this sacrifice became not only a tragedy but a claim to moral authority. Victory, in the Soviet narrative, was earned in blood. That narrative was not false. The Red Army destroyed the majority of German divisions. It absorbed the hardest blows and endured losses unmatched by any other power. These facts gave Soviet leadership immense leverage in shaping how the war would be remembered, especially within Eastern Europe and the post-war socialist world. What the narrative minimized was dependence. American trucks carried Soviet troops forward. American locomotives kept rail lines moving. American food-fed soldiers and workers alike. None of this diminished Soviet bravery, but it complicated the story of total acknowledging that support risked weakening the legitimacy of a system built on endurance and sacrifice alone. So the emphasis narrowed. Soviet memory centered on battles, heroism, and loss. Material aid became footnotes, then omissions. Over time, absence hardened into assumption. Generations learned a version of victory that was emotionally true, but strategically incomplete. And once institutionalized, that version became resistant to correction, not because of malice, but because it supported identity. Wars end. Stories do not. During the conflict, Allied media focused on unity. Newspapers avoided distinctions that might fracture morale. Newsreels emphasized shared purpose. Victory belonged to us, not to any single nation. This language made sense in wartime, but it carried consequences. After the war, attention shifted quickly to rebuilding and confrontation with a new adversary. There was little appetite for revisiting uncomfortable imbalances among former allies. Films, textbooks, and commemorations leaned on familiar arcs: resistance, sacrifice, liberation. Complexity was trimmed for clarity. American contributions appeared, but often as support roles. Trucks became background, factories vanished entirely. The public saw soldiers, flags, and leaders, rarely supply chains or production figures. Over time, repetition transformed emphasis into belief. What is repeated feels true. What is omitted feels irrelevant. By the time historians began re-examining the full scale of American involvement, popular memory was already settled. Correcting it required challenging, not facts, but identity, and identity rarely yields easily. At its core, the question of credit is uncomfortable. To fully acknowledge American dominance in material power requires confronting dependency. It asks uncomfortable questions of pride, endurance, and ownership. For nations that suffered first and longest, sharing credit feels like dilution. For the United States, insisting on recognition risks appearing self-congratulatory. So silence became convenient. No one lied outright. No single actor rewrote history alone. Instead, emphasis drifted toward what felt emotionally justifiable. Sacrifice was visible. Endurance was heroic. Logistics were technical. But wars are not won by emotion alone. They are won by the fusion of courage and capacity, of sacrifice and supply, of men willing to fight and systems capable of sustaining them. When credit ignores one side of that equation, history becomes incomplete, even if it remains sincere. And that incompleteness would come into sharp focus during the war's final, irreversible turning point, when Allied powers surged forward with a momentum that no longer depended on survival, but on inevitability. By the summer of 1944, the character of the war in Europe had changed. Survival was no longer the central question. Momentum was. On June 6, Allied forces landed in Normandy. The beaches themselves were brutal, chaotic, and costly. But the landings were not the turning point because of heroism alone. They were decisive because they could be sustained. Within days, then weeks, the beaches became ports. Temporary harbors rose from the sea. Roads filled with traffic. The invasion did not pause to recover. It expanded. Behind the front lines, American logistics moved with mechanical precision. Fuel pipelines were laid across open fields. Repair units restored damaged vehicles almost as quickly as they were lost. Replacement troops arrived in organized waves. Ammunition shortages, so common earlier in the war, failed to materialize. German commanders recognized the danger almost immediately. They had faced courage before. They had endured resistance. What they could not withstand was pressure that never eased. As Allied forces broke out of Normandy in late July, the pace accelerated dramatically. American units advanced faster than planners had predicted, not because the enemy had collapsed, but because supply lines refused to break. Armored columns pushed forward day after day, limited less by resistance than by how quickly fuel could be delivered to the front. This was not accidental. It was structural. The United States had planned for this moment years earlier. The trucks rolling through France were not improvised. They were built, shipped, and organized with the assumption that one day entire armies would depend on uninterrupted flow. The result was a form of warfare Germany could not match movement without exhaustion. British and Canadian forces advanced alongside them. Supported by the same logistical web, air power dominated the skies. Rail lines behind German positions were shattered. Retreat became a series of forced withdrawals rather than strategic decisions. In the east, the Soviet Union launched massive offensives of its own. German armies were crushed between advancing fronts. Yet even there, mobility told its own story. Soviet forces moved faster and farther than earlier in the war, supported by vehicles, fuel, and transport systems that had not existed in 1941. Belate, Sumere, the German war effort, was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to delay. The psychological shift was unmistakable. Allied commanders spoke not of holding ground, but of exploiting breakthroughs. German commanders spoke of buying time. The imbalance was no longer theoretical. It was visible in every retreat, every abandoned vehicle, every exhausted column unable to move without fuel. And yet, in public language, the framing remained cautious. Press releases emphasized Allied cooperation. Victories were described collectively. No nation claimed dominance. Even as American formations increasingly carried the operational load in Western Europe. This restraint was deliberate. Unity remained essential. The war was not over, but beneath the surface, the outcome had become inevitable. The Allies now possessed something Germany could not replace. Sustained momentum backed by unlimited production. Every mile gained increased pressure. Every delay weakened the enemy further. There would be no dramatic reverse-only acceleration. This was the true turning point of the war. Not a single battle, not a single decision, but the moment when Allied power became self-sustaining and German resistance became mathematically unsustainable. From this point forward, the question was no longer if Germany would lose, but how quickly. And as that end drew closer, another process began quietly alongside the advance. Political calculations. Post-war positioning. Decisions about memory that would outlast the fighting itself. Because even before the final battles were fought, the story of victory was already being shaped carefully, selectively, and with an eye toward the world that would follow. By early 1945, the war in Europe had entered its final phase. German forces were no longer capable of coordinated strategic action. What remained was resistance, without recovery units, fighting bravely in isolation, cut off from fuel, replacements, and hope. In the West, Allied armies crossed into Germany itself. The advance was relentless. Cities fell not because they were surrounded for months, but because